"You're reliable, but you're not exciting enough for the life I want," she said during dinner. I quietly nodded and left forever. Months later, she accidentally discovered my interview trending across social media while working a weekend shift she couldn't afford to miss. "You're reliable, but you're not exciting enough for the life I want." I stared at her for a second. She was cutting into her salmon like the words meant nothing. Like she'd said pass the salt or the check took forever tonight. Her fork scraped the plate. The restaurant noise filled in around us. Other couples laughing, a baby crying 2 tables over, the distant clatter of the kitchen. I sat there. The words sounded simple on the surface, but what she really meant was worse. What she really meant was, I've already decided. I've already made the comparison. I've already looked at you next to someone else, and you came up short. What she really meant was that being the man who showed up every single time, the man who never missed a bill, never missed a birthday, never let her down when it counted, wasn't enough. That dependability, the thing my father told me women respected above everything, was actually my biggest flaw. I nodded slowly. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't even finish my food. I just folded my napkin, set it on the table, and left. Months later, she would see my face everywhere online, and she would be standing in a place she couldn't afford to leave to do anything about it. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. What I lost that night wasn't just a girlfriend. I want to be honest about that, because it's easy to look back now and minimize it. To say it was for the best, or I saw it coming. But I didn't see it coming. Not really. And what I lost was substantial. I lost 3 years of my life. Not wasted. I don't think time spent loving someone is ever wasted. But 3 years of mornings and inside jokes and shared grocery lists and a future I had genuinely mapped out. I had thought about a ring. I'm not embarrassed to say that. I'd gone into a jewelry store once, alone, just to look, just to get a sense of what things cost. I'd taken a picture of one and sent it to my friend Keith with no context, and he'd texted back bro and 3 fire emojis. I lost the apartment we'd shared for 14 months on the Upper East Side. A 1-bedroom with good light and a kitchen big enough for 2 people to cook in without bumping into each other constantly, which was rare in New York and which we had both agreed felt like fate when we signed the lease. I lost the mutual friends who had, over time, become more hers than mine. Not because they didn't like me, but because she was louder and funnier in a crowd, and people tend to orbit energy. I lost the version of the future I'd been quietly constructing in the back of my head. The one where we figured it out. Where she eventually settled, or I eventually became whoever she needed me to be, or both of those things happened at once, and we ended up somewhere good together. That version died over salmon and a glass of white wine on a Tuesday night. I didn't cry when I left the restaurant. I cried later, alone, in the car I'd parked 3 blocks away because street parking near that restaurant was always impossible, and by the time I got to it and sat down and gripped the steering wheel, something cracked open in my chest that I hadn't expected. I sat there for maybe 40 minutes. Then I drove home to figure out how to pack my life into boxes. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. My name is Brian. I was 29 when this happened. I grew up in Queens, moved to Manhattan for work, and by every reasonable measure was doing fine. Not spectacular, but fine. I had a steady job in financial analysis at a mid-sized firm in Midtown, not Wall Street glamour, but solid work, decent pay, the kind of job you could build something real from if you were patient. I was patient. That was always my thing. Sharon and I had been together for 3 years and 2 months. We met when I was 26 and she was 25. We were both living in the city, both figuring it out, both young enough to think that figuring it out together made more sense than doing it alone. She was beautiful. She was funny. She had opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to voice them, which I found magnetic at first and occasionally exhausting later. She worked in fashion PR, not a huge firm, but a respectable one, and she was good at her job in the way that people who genuinely love an industry tend to be good at it. We were a real couple. I need you to understand that before anything else. This wasn't a situationship or a convenience arrangement. We were real, which is exactly what made the dinner so devastating. I need to go back to the beginning. Not because I'm still hung up on her. I'm not, and I'll prove that by the end of this, but because the beginning matters. You can't understand what broke if you don't know what it looked like whole. I met Sharon at a rooftop party in Williamsburg on a Thursday night in late June. I didn't want to go. My friend Randy had practically dragged me, texting me 11 times over the course of an afternoon with escalating levels of guilt. Come on, man. Then you never come out anymore. Then I will literally come to your apartment and stand outside your door, and finally, there will be food. That last one got me. The party was at someone's apartment building, a friend of Randy's, some guy named Dylan who apparently threw parties on his roof every summer and was locally famous for it. There were maybe 60 people up there. String lights. A cooler full of canned beer. Someone had dragged a Bluetooth speaker up the stairs and was playing something that sounded like a Spotify playlist titled Rooftop Summer Vibes, which I mean is neither a compliment nor an insult. I was standing near the edge of the roof looking out at the skyline, which was genuinely beautiful, even for someone who'd grown up seeing it his whole life, when I heard a voice next to me say, "I always feel like I'm supposed to have a deeper thought when I look at the city from up here. Like something philosophical is supposed to occur to me. But honestly, I'm mostly just thinking about whether I parked in a legal spot." I turned. She was standing about 3 feet away, holding a can of beer by the tab, squinting slightly at the skyline, like she was waiting for it to reveal something. I said, "What street?" She blinked at me. What street did you park on? I can usually tell you if it's legal." She told me. I thought about it for a second, genuinely, running through the alternate side parking rules in my head, which is a deeply unsexy thing to know, but which I had absorbed through years of navigating New York street parking. I told her she was probably fine, but to move the car before 8 the next morning, just in case. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, a little surprised, like I'd done something she wasn't expecting. "That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me at a party in years," she said. We talked for 3 hours. We didn't move from that spot by the railing. Randy found me at one point and raised his eyebrows, and I ignored him. Sharon talked about her job, about growing up in New Jersey and the specific psychology of being a New Jersey kid who moves to the city and has to prove she belongs there. I talked about Queens, about my father's hardware store that I used to work in every summer, about the way I'd ended up in finance not because it was my passion, but because I was good with numbers and good with systems, and those skills turned out to be worth something. She listened. That's what I remember most, looking back. She actually listened. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered things I'd said 20 minutes earlier and circled back to them. By the end of the night, I had her number and she had mine, and Randy was insufferably smug about it the whole subway ride home. Our first date was a week later. I'd asked her to dinner, but she'd redirected. "Dinner feels like a job interview. Can we do something less formal?" And suggested a walk across the Brooklyn Bridge followed by food from a cart on the other side. I said yes without hesitation. She showed up in a yellow sundress and white sneakers, and I remember thinking very clearly, "Oh, this is a problem. Not a bad problem. The kind of problem that means you're already in it." We walked the bridge. She talked about a book she'd just finished, something about the history of color and art, which I knew nothing about, but found genuinely interesting the way she described it. I talked about a documentary I'd watched about deep-sea fish, which she found baffling and hilarious. We ate lamb over rice from a cart and stood on the sidewalk and talked for another 2 hours before either of us thought to check the time. She kissed me first. We were standing outside a subway entrance, and she'd been mid-sentence about something. I don't even remember what, and she just stopped and kissed me. Quick and certain, like a decision she'd already made. "Okay," she said, stepping back. "Okay," I agreed. I floated home. The early months were the kind of thing you'd be annoying to describe in detail. We were happy. She was warm and funny and sharp, and she made me feel like the best version of myself. Not because she was constantly flattering me, but because she paid attention to me in a way that made me feel worth paying attention to. There's a memory I keep coming back to. We'd been together maybe 4 months, and it was a Sunday in October. Cold enough for jackets, but still sunny. We'd gone to the farmer's market in Union Square, and she'd insisted on buying an unreasonable amount of apples, 3 different varieties, because she had a theory that the apples you buy at the farmer's market actually taste like apples and not like the idea of apples. We carried them home in a canvas bag, and she made a pie from scratch in my kitchen that afternoon, which I didn't know she could do, and the whole apartment smelled like cinnamon and brown sugar, and I sat on the counter and watched her roll the dough and thought, I could do this forever. She wasn't perfect. She got impatient in lines. She could be dismissive when she was tired. She sometimes made decisions about our plans without asking me, and then seemed surprised when I had opinions about them. But these felt like quirks, then. The kind of things you learn to navigate around when you love someone. I wasn't looking for perfect. I was looking for real. She was real. That's why I stayed. That's why it hurt the way it did. If I'm being completely honest with myself, and that's the whole point of doing this, isn't it? The signs were there before the end. Not flashing neon, but there. The kind of thing that makes sense in retrospect, even if you were looking somewhere else at the time. The first thing I remember noticing was the comparisons. It started small. We'd be watching something on TV, a show, a movie, whatever, and a character would do something grand and romantic, and Sharon would sigh in this particular way. A soft, wistful exhale, like she was watching something she deserved but didn't have. I'd look over at her and she'd catch my expression and shake her head and say, "Nothing. It's just a show." And I'd let it go. But it was never just a show. She had a colleague at work named Marcus. I should have paid more attention to Marcus earlier than I did. He was in client relations. She mentioned him occasionally. Marcus closed that deal. Marcus got us into that event, and the mentions had a specific quality to them. Admiring. Slightly breathless. In the way that people get breathless when they're describing someone they find aspirational. "He just has this energy," she told me once. "Like he walks into a room and everything shifts." "What kind of energy?" I asked. "Confident. You know, like he's not worried about anything." I nodded. I stored that away. I told myself it was harmless. That should have been my first real warning. The social media thing crept up gradually. Sharon had always been on Instagram. She worked in PR. It was practically professional requirement. But around year 2 of us, the relationship to it changed. She started spending more time on it in the evening, scrolling with this particular focused expression, the phone angled slightly away from me. She started following accounts I didn't recognize, lifestyle people, men and women who posted photos from rooftop pools in Miami and private dinners in the meatpacking district, people whose lives looked like an advertisement for something aspirational and vague. She'd show me things sometimes. "Look at this place," she'd say, handing me her phone, and I'd look at a restaurant or a hotel or a vacation destination and say nice, and hand it back, and something in her expression would tighten slightly, like my reaction had confirmed something she didn't want confirmed. I didn't know what to do with that, so I didn't do anything. Her friends didn't help. She had a core group, Pamela, who worked in finance and had recently started dating someone who made a lot of money, and a woman named Terry who I never quite warmed to, who had strong opinions about what women deserved and wasn't shy about sharing them at dinner parties. Terry was single, loudly, as a philosophical position rather than a circumstance. She believed in a very specific type of man, someone who was ambitious in visible, dramatic ways, who bought bottles at clubs and took weekend trips to Tulum, and whose career trajectory could be tracked on LinkedIn like a rocket launch. I didn't fit that description. I was building slowly. My career was progressing, but quietly. I drove a sensible car. I had a 401k. I thought about the future in a way that apparently read as boring to certain audiences. I'd catch Sharon with Terry and Pamela, and when I'd arrive to pick her up from their brunches, there'd be this brief recalibration in the room. A slight cooling. A polite redirecting of conversation. The kind of thing you feel before you understand it. "What do you guys talk about when I'm not around?" I asked her once, keeping my voice light. "Girl stuff," she said. "Nothing important." I ignored it at the time. The subtle disrespects were the ones that stung most, looking back. They were small enough that I second-guessed myself when I felt them. She'd cut me off mid-sentence when she was excited and not apologize. She'd reference something I'd said earlier in a slightly mocking tone when we were with other people. Not cruel, but with an edge, like she was gently repositioning me. She forgot my coworkers' names after I'd mentioned them multiple times. Not because she was incapable, but because she wasn't really listening when I talked about work. My work wasn't interesting enough. There was one night, maybe 8 months before the breakup, when we were at dinner with Keith and his girlfriend, and somehow the conversation turned to goals. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? That kind of thing. I talked about wanting to move into a senior analyst role, about having saved enough to think about a down payment on something in Brooklyn if prices shifted at all. Solid, real, achievable things. Sharon was quiet through most of it. Later, in the cab home, she looked out the window and said, "I just want more than that, you know?" "More than what?" I asked. "More than planning. More than careful." I didn't say anything. The city moved past the windows. What I found next changed how I remembered that night entirely. It was a Saturday morning in February, about 4 months before the end. I'd woken up early. I'm a 6 a.m. person, always have been, even on weekends, and Sharon was still asleep. I went to make coffee. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, which wasn't unusual. She sometimes charged it there overnight. What was unusual was that it was face up and unlocked, and as I walked past, a notification preview appeared before the screen went dark. I didn't snoop. I want to be clear about that. I didn't pick up the phone and read through her messages. I'm not built that way. But the preview was right there, and my eyes caught it before my brain decided not to look. It was from someone named M, just the initial, and the preview read, "Had such a good time last night. We should." That was all I saw. The screen went dark. I stood there for a moment. M. I made the coffee. I stood by the window and looked at the street below and went through what I knew. She'd been out last night with work people. She'd come home a little after midnight, slightly flushed, a little electric in the way she sometimes got after good social energy. I'd been half asleep. She'd kissed me on the cheek and gone to the bathroom and come to bed. Had such a good time last night. I thought about Marcus. I turned the thought over for a long time. That morning, while she slept, I considered walking in and asking. I considered checking her phone, which I told myself I wouldn't do, and then found myself standing there genuinely tempted by, which disturbed me more than the message itself. I considered doing nothing. I did nothing. When she woke up and came into the kitchen, she looked happy, rested. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter and said, "Did you sleep okay?" in the cheerful, casual tone of someone whose conscience is clear or someone very good at mourning. "Fine," I said. "Good." She picked up her phone from the counter, glanced at it briefly, set its screen down. My eyes tracked that movement without my permission. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just tired." I don't know, to this day, what that message was. I have theories. I have a theory that leans in one direction pretty firmly. But I made the choice not to know for certain, and I have to live with that choice. What I do know is that something shifted in me that February morning. A small but structural shift, like a crack in a wall that isn't visible yet, but changes the integrity of everything around it. There was one detail I still hadn't figured out, and it mattered more than the message itself. The next 4 months were a slow unraveling. Not dramatic. Not screaming matches or thrown objects, or any of the things that make for clean stories. Just a gradual, painful loosening of everything that had held us together. We argued more. Not about big things, usually, about small things, which is almost worse, because small arguments don't justify the weight of feeling behind them, and so they tend to spiral. I'd come home late from a long day, and she'd be short with me, and I'd be short back, and suddenly we'd be 20 minutes into a fight about whose turn it was to buy dish soap that was actually about everything else. She went out more. This isn't a criticism. She had every right to her own social life, but it was a change. She'd come home energized from those nights, animated and bright, and then I'd watch that energy dim slightly when she looked at me, like I was the wrong frequency. I started noticing that she didn't reach for my hand as often. I started noticing that she'd stopped leaving little notes on the fridge. She'd done that in the early years. Just quick things. "Good luck today," or "Bought us good cheese. Don't let me eat all of it." And the absence of them was more significant than it should have been. Here's the thing I want to be honest about. I wasn't perfect either. I worked a lot. I'd been given more responsibility at the firm over the previous year, and I was handling it, but handling it required hours. I'd come home tired and go quiet, sitting with my laptop on the couch while she tried to tell me about her day, giving her the kind of listening that's technically attentive but emotionally absent. I could see it frustrated her. I didn't always have the energy to fix it. I was also, I think, conflict avoidant in ways that made things worse. When I saw the message on her phone, I should have said something. When I felt her pulling away, I should have named it. Instead, I went quiet and hoped the distance would close on its own, which is not a strategy, it's a wish. She was genuinely struggling with something during that period. I could see it even when I couldn't reach her. She was in her late 20s, working in an industry that ran partly on aesthetics and access, surrounded by people who seemed to be living more glamorously than she was. She had ambitions that her job was only partially satisfying. She'd wanted to launch her own boutique PR firm eventually. She'd mentioned it in the early days of us, and she'd let that dream get quiet, and I think the quiet of it was eating at her. She wasn't wrong that I was reliable. She wasn't wrong that I wasn't flashy or dramatic. She wasn't wrong that I thought more about stability than about adventure. Those things were all true. What she was wrong about was what those things meant. What she confused was steadiness for smallness. She looked at me and saw a ceiling when she should have been seeing a foundation. But I understand it now. I understand the particular anxiety of standing at the edge of your 20s and feeling like the life you want is happening somewhere you're not. I just wish she'd talk to me about it instead of building a case. "Can we just talk?" I asked her once, a month or so before the end. We were sitting on the couch on a Sunday afternoon, both of us on our phones, not really together even though we were in the same room. She looked up. About what? About us. About how things feel. She set her phone down. The expression on her face was careful. Brian, I know something's off, I said. I'm not imagining it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've just been thinking a lot. About what I want. About where I'm going. And where am I in that? I asked. I don't know, she said. Softly. Honestly. That honesty should have prepared me for what was coming. In a way, it did. In a way, the dinner wasn't a surprise at all. And yet, she picked the restaurant. That should have told me something. She picked the restaurant and made the reservation and asked me if Tuesday worked, with a particular deliberateness that wasn't quite like her usual casual approach to these things. I said yes. I assumed it was an anniversary-adjacent dinner, a make-good gesture after the tension of recent weeks. It was a decent place. Not the nicest place we'd ever been. Not the cheapest, a kind of middle ground, which I have since wondered about. Nice enough to feel significant. Not so nice as to feel cruel. We ordered. She had the salmon. I had a steak I barely touched. The first 20 minutes were fine. We talked about her week, about a client she'd been managing, about a movie we'd both been meaning to see. Normal conversation. I was almost relaxed. Then she set down her fork. She lined it up against the edge of her plate with a precision that felt deliberate, like a period at the end of a sentence she'd been writing in her head. I need to say something, she said. I looked at her. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she said. About us. About what I want. About the kind of life I want to have. Okay, I said. Carefully. You're a good person, Brian. She looked at me steadily. You're genuinely one of the best people I've ever known. But, I thought. But, she said. There it was. You're reliable. You're stable. You're everything that's supposed to matter. She paused. But you're not exciting enough for the life I want. The table felt very far away suddenly. The noise of the restaurant pressed in around us, and then seemed to recede. What does that mean? I asked. It means, she stopped. Look down. It means I've been thinking about what I actually want my life to look like. And it's bigger than this. It's more than. She gestured slightly, in a way that seemed to encompass the restaurant, the city, me. More than careful and planned. So you want to break up? I said. I think we want different things. That's not what I asked. She met my eyes. Yes, I think we should break up. I sat with that for a moment. The baby 2 tables overhead started crying again. Someone laughed loudly from the bar. Is there someone else? I asked. Quiet. Steady. She didn't answer immediately. That pause was its own kind of answer. Not in the way you're thinking, she said finally. I nodded slowly. I turned that non-answer over in my mind and decided I had everything I needed from it. Is this because of Marcus? I asked. Her face did something complicated. A flash of something, surprise, or guilt, or both, and then the careful composure returned. This is about me, she said. About what I want for my life. Okay, I said. I picked up my napkin from my lap. I folded it once, twice, and set it on the table next to my plate. I took out my wallet and set 3 $20 bills next to it, more than my share of whatever the bill would be. Brian, you should stay, I said. You picked the restaurant. I stood up. She looked up at me with an expression I still can't fully decode. Not triumphant. Not entirely certain. Something in between. I hope you find what you're looking for, I said. And I meant it. Then I left. Moving out took a weekend. Keith helped me. He drove a rented van from Queens on Saturday morning and didn't ask many questions, which is the best thing a friend can do in that particular situation. We worked in shifts. I packed. He carried. We both pretended the whole enterprise was logistically uncomplicated. Sharon wasn't there. She'd gone to stay with Pamela for the weekend, which I had asked her to do and which she'd agreed to without argument. The apartment felt strange without her presence. Not empty exactly, because her things were still there, but muted, like a space between sounds. I found one of her hair ties in the bathroom drawer and stood there holding it for too long. I moved into a smaller place in Astoria. 1 bedroom, lower floor, no view to speak of. I told myself it was temporary, which was true and which also felt like the kind of thing you say to get through the immediate present without fully processing what it means. The first 2 weeks were the worst. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the particular quality of silence in a new apartment after 3 years of cohabitation. You get used to another person's patterns, the sound of them moving in the kitchen, the specific way they close a door, the background presence of someone else existing in the same space as you. Without it, the silence has a texture. I didn't sleep well. The mutual friends situation was predictable and still unpleasant. The couple friendships, 2 pairs of people we'd gotten close to together, went to Sharon, which I'd expected. Keith stayed firmly in my corner. Randy, who I'd known since high school, was loyal in the way of someone who genuinely liked both parties and handled it by mentioning neither of us to the other, which was its own kind of mercy. I heard, through the peripheral information that seeps through even when you're trying not to track someone, that Sharon was posting on Instagram again. A lot. That her feed had shifted, more nights out, more events, more photos with people I didn't recognize from angles that suggested a more expansive social life. I didn't look. I blocked the impulse several times and once gave in and then immediately regretted it and put my phone face down on the couch and went to do the dishes. I heard she'd started seeing Marcus. This came through Pamela, who told Randy, who didn't tell me directly, but whose expression when we got beers 3 weeks after my move out told me everything without words. I nodded when he confirmed it. You okay? Randy asked. Working on it, I said. There were rumors, which is the petty machinery of shared social circles doing what it does, that I'd been neglectful, that I'd been too focused on work, that she'd needed something I couldn't give her, and it was more complicated than I was letting on. I didn't address any of it, not because I was above it, but because I genuinely didn't have the energy, and also because I understood, at some level, that engaging with a narrative is how you get trapped in it. I stayed silent. I let the story be whatever it needed to be for people who weren't me. What I was actually doing during those silent weeks, no one would have predicted that. I want to be transparent. I didn't start changing because I wanted her back. I didn't start changing because I wanted to prove something to her, or to anyone who'd sided with her, or to the version of myself that had sat in that restaurant and folded his napkin without saying all the things he could have said. Revenge is a kind of attachment, and the thing I needed most in those weeks was detachment. I started changing because I finally had no one else's preferences to accommodate. And in the silence of that Astoria apartment, I heard a voice that had been getting quieter for 3 years, saying, "What about what you want? The career thing first," because that was where the clarity arrived earliest. I'd been doing solid, competent work at the firm for 4 years. I was well regarded. My reviews were good. I was on a track that, if I stayed on it, would deliver me to a comfortable senior analyst role in approximately 2.5 years. I'd been satisfied with that track, mostly because it felt responsible and because Sharon's unspoken disdain for the pace of it had made me defensive, and defensive people don't reconsider, they dig in. With her gone, I looked at the track with fresh eyes. I had an idea I'd been carrying around for almost a year, a specific analytical framework for evaluating mid-market company risk that I thought had genuine application potential, not just inside the firm, but as a methodology I could develop independently. I'd mentioned it to my manager once, almost offhandedly, and he'd been interested, but we'd never followed up. The idea had just sat there in the back of my head like a car parked in a spot I kept walking past. 3 weeks after the breakup, I started working on it at night. Not dramatically, not in a montage. Just, after dinner, laptop out, kitchen table, 2 or 3 hours of focused work on something that was mine. A framework document. Then a draft article. Then a more formal paper. The fitness thing came a couple weeks later. This part feels almost cliché to say, but it's true. I started running. I'd always been in decent shape. I played basketball on weekends. I took the stairs, but I'd never had a real discipline around it. I started running the East River Path early in the mornings, before work. 3 miles first, then 5. The structure of it, the way it demanded something from my body and then delivered a return on that demand, was exactly what I needed. I lost weight I hadn't known I was carrying. I started sleeping better. The specific heaviness of the post-breakup weeks began to lift, not all at once, but in stages, the way the sky gets gradually lighter before you actually see the sun. I read more. Not self-help books. I want to be specific about this because I find the genre slightly oppressive in the way it implies a finish line. Just books. Fiction. History. A biography of a Japanese architect I found at a used bookstore in Astoria and devoured over a weekend. I remembered that I was someone who got genuinely absorbed by things, and that getting absorbed by things was one of the best versions of myself, and that I'd been operating in a low-level distraction state for much of the previous year. I called my father more. He's in Queens, my mother too, and I'd been doing the thing you do when you're wrapped up in a relationship where you see your parents every few weeks and call dutifully, but aren't really present. I started having actual conversations with him. He asked how I was doing, and I told him the truth, which surprised both of us. He told me about building his hardware store from nothing, about the early years when the margins were terrifying, about the discipline required to keep building when nothing seemed to be moving. "You're a builder," he told me one evening. "Builders don't look fast from the outside, but they're always going somewhere." I sat with that for a long time. I also, quietly, started developing the methodological paper into something more ambitious. I connected with a former professor from my MBA program, a woman who ran a small applied finance research group at Columbia, and she found the work interesting enough to want to meet. We had coffee. She introduced me to 2 other people. The paper grew into something with actual potential. My confidence changed in this period. Not in the loud, performative way. I didn't suddenly become someone who walked into rooms differently or started dressing in a way designed to announce something. It was quieter than that. I stopped waiting for external validation of what I was doing. I stopped calibrating my days against someone else's idea of what impressive looked like. I just did the work. I trusted the work. I didn't think about Sharon very much toward the end of this period. When I did, I felt something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite acceptance, something more like understanding. I understood what had happened, and I didn't need to be angry about it. I just needed to keep building. It was Curtis who told me. Curtis is a friend from the firm. Not a close friend exactly, more of a same professional circle, grab lunch occasionally, kind of friendship, the type that becomes more interesting in retrospect because they're observant and don't editorialize. We were getting lunch at a deli near the office about 7 months after the breakup, when he brought it up with the particular careful neutrality of someone who has been holding information for a while and has decided today is the day. "I ran into Pamela at a thing last weekend," he said. "How's she?" I asked, not particularly invested. "She's fine." He stirred his coffee. "She said some things." I looked at him. He had the expression of someone choosing words like he was crossing a stream on stepping stones. "She said Sharon's been having a rough time," he said. "Rough how?" "The Marcus thing." He set down his spoon. "Apparently it's been not what she expected." I held my reaction still. "What do you mean?" "Pamela said Marcus is," he paused. "Basically what you'd predict. Exciting on the surface. Less reliable underneath. Goes out constantly, keeps things undefined, isn't interested in anything that feels like commitment. She told Pamela she thought he'd be different once they were actually together." I nodded slowly. "Also," Curtis paused again. This pause was longer. "Pamela said something else." "What?" "She said that the night before the breakup, the Tuesday, Marcus and Sharon had gotten dinner. Just the 2 of them." He looked at me. "Pamela said she thinks Sharon broke up with you because Marcus had told her he might be interested in something, and she didn't want to be with you at the same time she was trying to figure that out." The deli was loud around us. Someone was shouting an order at the counter. "She left for someone specific," I said. "That's what Pamela thinks." She felt guilty enough that she wanted someone to know. I processed this. I turned it over. I noticed the difference between how I would have felt hearing this 6 months ago versus how I felt hearing it now. And the difference was significant. 6 months ago, it would have been devastation. Now it was closer to confirmation of something I'd already essentially concluded. Not pleasant, but not destabilizing. "She didn't cheat," I said. Not as a defense of her. As a clarification of facts. "No," Curtis agreed. "Apparently, she was trying to do it right. Just deciding before telling you." "Okay," I said. Curtis looked at me with a kind of assessment in his eyes. "You're handling this remarkably well." "I've had time," I said. What I didn't tell Curtis was that this information completed something I'd been carrying like an unfinished chord. Now I had the whole picture. It didn't change anything about where I was, but it changed how clearly I understood where I'd been. And what came next changed where I was going entirely. The paper went to a conference first. The research group at Columbia, my former professor, Dr. Renata Miles, and 2 graduate students she'd brought in, had been developing my risk assessment framework alongside me for about 5 months. What had started as a document I'd been writing at my kitchen table in Astoria had become a formal methodology with real testing behind it, applied to a set of mid-market company case studies and producing results that were, according to Dr. Miles, genuinely novel in a way that finance research often isn't. She submitted it to a conference on applied financial risk hosted in partnership by Columbia and NYU. A relatively small conference, academic, not glamorous. Exactly the kind of thing that sounds unimpressive until you understand what it means to have your work formally validated in that context. The paper was accepted. I presented in April, in a room of maybe 100 people who were mostly academics and firm professionals. I'd been nervous preparing. Public speaking was not historically my strongest mode, but when I got up there, something settled in me. The work was good. I knew it was good. Standing behind good work steadies you. The presentation went well. What I didn't anticipate was that a journalist from a financial industry publication had been in the room as a guest of one of the conference organizers. He found me afterward and asked for 30 minutes. 30 minutes became an hour and a half at a coffee shop near campus. The article ran 2 weeks later. New framework offers practical alternative to standard mid-market risk models. It wasn't front-page news, but in the specific world of financial analysis, it was noticed. My managing director at the firm called me into his office the day after the article went live. This was not something he did often. He was a compact, serious man named Gerald Ferris who expressed enthusiasm through targeted directness rather than warmth. "I read this," he said, sliding a printed copy across his desk. "Okay," I said. "I'd like to talk about how we incorporate this into our practice," he said, "and about your trajectory here." 3 weeks later, I was promoted. Not to the senior analyst role I'd been tracking toward, one level above that. Director of Risk Methodology. It came with a title and a team and a number on my paycheck that made me sit in my car in the parking garage for 10 minutes when I got the offer, just quietly. I accepted. But the thing that really changed the game, the thing I didn't see coming, was what happened after. Dr. Miles had a contact at a financial podcast called The Yield Curve, hosted by a guy named David Park who'd built a genuinely substantial following among young professionals and industry people over the past 3 years. It was smart, accessible, not intimidatingly academic. David reached out to me in May. "I want to do an episode on your framework," he said during our first call. "But I also want to talk about the broader story, the analyst who developed this independently, outside the firm context. Because that's rare. And people respond to that." We recorded in June. The episode ran on a Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, it was the most shared episode that show had produced in 18 months. The comments were full of people, young analysts, MBA students, industry professionals, talking about the methodology, yes, but also about something else. About the quiet, patient building of something real. About the difference between looking successful and being on the way to something that would actually last. Someone clipped a 90-second segment and put it on social media. In the clip, David had asked me, "What drove you to develop this when you were presumably building a conventional career at the same time?" And I'd said, without thinking about it much, "I think there was a period where I was letting other people's definition of success organize my choices. And when that stopped, when I stopped doing that, I had a lot more energy to put into the work. The work got better when it was mine." The clip went modestly viral. Not millions of views, but enough. Within 2 days, my face was in places I hadn't expected it to be. Sharon worked Saturdays. This was something she'd resisted for years, fashion PR being, in theory, a Monday through Friday industry. But she joined a new firm in January that operated differently, client-driven, events-heavy, and the occasional weekend shift was part of the deal. She complained about it once to Pamela, according to the fractions of information that still reached me through mutual orbits, saying she hadn't expected to be doing weekend work at 28 and that it wasn't the trajectory she'd had in mind. She was at that office on the Saturday morning when it happened. I know this because Pamela told Keith, who told me later, with the specific sheen of someone who has witnessed something they don't quite have words for. The way it went, as best I can reconstruct it, Sharon was eating lunch at her desk. A Saturday, minimal staff, the kind of quiet that settles over offices when the building is half empty, and scrolling her phone in the unfocused way you do during a 15-minute break when you don't really want to be where you are. She saw the clip. It appeared in her feed because someone she followed had reshared it. Not anyone she expected. Some industry contact, a PR professional she'd connected with at an event months ago, someone entirely unrelated to my world. It appeared the way things appear when the algorithm decides something is gaining enough momentum to be worth surfacing broadly. She saw my face before she heard my name. That's how Pamela described it. She saw my face and had a half-second of disconnected recognition before the sound caught up. And then she heard my voice saying, "When I stopped letting other people's definition of success organize my choices, when I stopped doing that, I had a lot more energy to put into the work." She watched it through to the end. She sat there for a while after, according to Pamela, who had texted Sharon during that stretch and gotten a delayed response that, when it came, was oddly short. Pamela thought something was wrong at first. She texted again, "You okay?" Sharon wrote back, "Yeah. Did you see Brian is on a podcast or something?" Pamela said she knew in that moment. She could read something in the phrasing, or something, the performance of casualness. She didn't press. She sent back a neutral "I heard," which was technically true because Keith had mentioned it in passing 2 days earlier. Sharon didn't say anything else about it in that text thread for several hours. But she looked up the full episode. Pamela found this out because Sharon mentioned it, eventually, in the particular way people mention things they're trying to minimize. I ended up listening to that whole podcast. It was kind of interesting. Her voice, Pamela said, had a quality to it. Not quite wistful, not quite regretful, something in between that she'd had to sit with before she could name it. What I imagine, and what Pamela essentially confirmed, is that Sharon sat in that quiet Saturday office and listened to me talk for an hour. Heard me describe the work, heard me describe the framework, heard David ask about the human story behind it, and understood, incrementally, over the course of that hour, a version of who I'd been becoming that she had no visibility into, because she'd been looking somewhere else. She'd been looking at Marcus, who was charming and alive in rooms the way I'd never been, who created that electric social atmosphere she'd craved. And I'd been building something real in the dark, alone, with no audience, on a kitchen table in Astoria. She sat in that Saturday office she couldn't afford to leave and couldn't call in from because the clients needed coverage and the weekend shift was non-negotiable. And she watched my face on a screen trending across the financial media world. There is no gloating in saying this. I want to be clear about that. What I feel when I think about that moment is something much more complicated than satisfaction. It's something closer to grief for both of us, for the 3 years, for the choices made, for the version of things that could have existed and didn't. But it happened, and she saw it, and she had to keep working until 6 p.m. The Marcus thing ended in August. I didn't learn about it directly. These things reach you in fragments when you're no longer inside the circle. A comment Randy made without quite meaning to, something Curtis mentioned over lunch, the particular silence from Pamela's direction that meant the news wasn't good. From what I pieced together, Marcus had been, from the beginning, exactly who any reasonable observer might have predicted him to be. Exciting in the way that things are exciting before they become familiar. The dinners and the events and the energy of him being in a room. All of it real and all of it, apparently, organized around Marcus's own pleasure and ambition rather than any genuine investment in another person. He hadn't been dishonest with Sharon. He just hadn't been present in the way she'd needed. He'd treated the relationship as something that fit into his life rather than something they were building together. He'd called things off in early August. Friendly about it, apparently. Unbothered, which was its own indignity. Sharon had, by that point, also started to understand certain things about her job situation that hadn't been clear in the spring. The firm she'd joined in January, the one with the Saturday shifts, was going through a restructuring. Her role wasn't eliminated, but it was redefined in ways that felt like a demotion dressed in lateral language. The clients she'd been excited about were redistributed. The trajectory she'd envisioned when she took the job had quietly shifted underneath her. She was, from what reached me, not in a great place. Pamela told Keith, and Keith told me with obvious discomfort because Keith genuinely cared about both of us. Sharon had said, at some point in those weeks, that she felt like she'd made a series of decisions that had all seemed right and none of which had landed the way she'd expected. I understood that feeling. I'd been in it myself. The difference was that I'd had it sooner, and it had pointed me somewhere. I want to be careful here about how I frame what I feel, because I know what this kind of story is supposed to make me feel, and I want to be honest that the feeling I actually had was more complicated than triumph. She wasn't a villain. She was someone who made choices based on what she thought she wanted, and the choices didn't deliver. That's human. That's the specific, ordinary tragedy of making decisions from an unexamined premise. The premise she'd been working from. That excitement was the highest value. That stability was indistinguishable from limitation. That the life she wanted existed somewhere just past the life she hadn't survived contact with reality. Reality had a way of doing that. It didn't announce itself. It just waited. I had nights, in that period, when I thought about what would have happened if I'd been different. If I'd been louder, more performative, the kind of person who creates a show of his own ambition. Would she have stayed? Probably for a while. Would it have been real? No. It would have been a costume, and I'd spent 3 years slowly learning that I wasn't built for costumes. I was built for the long game. And the long game, it turned out, was winning. The life I was living in August was, by any measure, the one I'd wanted. I had work I was genuinely proud of. I had a team under me that I was learning to lead. I had the framework paper being cited in 2 different publications. I had the podcast clip that people were still sharing months later. I had mornings where I woke up and felt, simply, like I was going somewhere real. I had also been on a few dates. Nothing serious. But the experience of talking to people with the confidence that comes from not needing them to confirm something about you, that was new and good. I'd been on a third date with a woman named Claudia who worked in urban planning and laughed at things in a way I found genuinely infectious. And I was looking forward to a fourth. The grass wasn't greener on the other side of the dinner. The grass was just grass, everywhere. You grew it or you didn't. Sharon had found that out. I hadn't needed her to, for my sake. But it was something. I saw her in October. Not a planned meeting. Not a dramatic setup. Just the city doing what the city does, which is put two people in the same coordinate at the same moment without asking either of them if they're ready. It was a Saturday morning, early, on the Upper West Side. I'd been at a breakfast meeting with Dr. Miles and David Park to discuss a follow-up episode. Things were moving forward in ways that kept requiring more coordination, and I was walking back toward the subway, coffee in hand, minding my own business and my own life. She was coming out of a cafe. I saw her before she saw me. She was looking down at her phone, wearing a coat I didn't recognize, her hair down in the way she used to wear it on weekends. She looked tired, not devastated, but tired in the specific way of someone who has been reevaluating. She looked up. There was a half second where both of us assessed whether we could pretend not to see each other, and both of us concluded we couldn't, and so we stopped. Brian, she said. Sharon, I said. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was just very quiet for a moment. I heard the podcast, she said. She said it straight out, like she decided that pretending she hadn't was beneath both of us. I appreciated that. Yeah. I said. You were good. She looked at me with something in her eyes that I recognized. Not regret. Not quite. But the specific expression of someone who is seeing you clearly for the first time in a long time and isn't sure what to do with that clarity. You always were good at what you did. I don't think She trailed off. I waited. I wasn't going to finish that sentence for her. I hope things are good, she said finally. I mean that. Things are good, I said. And I meant it in a way I couldn't have meant it 12 months ago. I hope they're good for you too. She smiled briefly. It didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was real. Take care of yourself, I said. I smiled, wished her well, and kept walking. My coffee was still warm. The city was bright and cold and impossibly itself. Somewhere ahead of me, in the work, in the mornings, and the long game I'd been playing without an audience, was everything I'd been building toward. I didn't look back. For the first time, she was the one being left behind.